September the 1st, 1939. German troops thrust deep into Poland to win a swift and absolute victory. Barely 20 years earlier, their forefathers had also been on the march, but back into their homeland as a defeated army. In November 1918, after 4 years of World War I, Germany's Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were being ground down by a remorseless offensive by British, French, and US troops. His people faced starvation. But already, a dangerous myth was taking root. The German generals and troops claimed that they hadn't been defeated in battle, but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians. Even so, at 11 in the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world order. He persuaded the world's leaders to sign up to a new League of Nations. At the Treaty of Versailles, they agreed that from now on, disputes between countries would be resolved not by fighting, but by debate in the League. The peoples of Europe were set free. Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismembered. Out of it, new nations were created: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size. But this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone celebrated the birth of countries like Czechoslovakia. Several of them contained substantial German minorities. One day, the desire to reunite the German peoples would come to haunt Europe. The war-torn German people also had one final indignity inflicted on them. They were forced to pay a massive £6.6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, something they could ill afford. And when he returned to America, Wilson's new world order immediately fell apart. The US Congress decided it could not risk being sucked into another war in Europe. It refused to join his league, and the US withdrew into isolationism. Germany was now a very different nation. It was still Europe's biggest country, but its militaristic monarchy had gone. It had become a democracy. But its government, the so-called Weimar Republic, was soon struck by a series of hammer blows. Street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists trying to start a revolution. Then, in 1923, the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of % a month. Ordinary people's savings were wiped out. This was fertile ground for a new breed of rabble-rousing right-wing politicians. Among them, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and been awarded the Iron Cross. On returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, and his fiery oratory soon enabled him to seize control of the small National Socialist or Nazi Party. In October 1923, Hitler and his henchmen attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government. It failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months. In prison, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he blamed Germany's ills on the Jews and demanded that it rebuild its strength and seek new territories in the East. On his release, he set about building the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. From now on, he would use the democratic system to achieve power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany prospered. Support for extremist parties, left and right, dwindled. Then suddenly, Hitler's opportunity arrived. In October 1929, the US stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost, and an economic depression swept across the world. Unemployment in Germany soared to over 6 million. Only extremist politicians seemed to offer a solution.
Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verfechten es fanatisch rücksichtlos.
Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, his Nazis were a true mass movement. And they had their own brown-shirted thugs, the SA stormtroops, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, leaving parliament paralyzed. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made him Chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag burned down. Hitler accused the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used them to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. At first, there was little sign of what was to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer concentrated on rebuilding Germany's economy. He spent millions on public works, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn system, to soak up the unemployed. But in secret, Hitler was also spending lavishly on a huge rearmament program. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men. The country was forbidden to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was trebled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler came out into the open. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It had 2,500 planes, far more than Britain or France. Unemployment plunged, and the Nazis became enormously popular. Now emboldened, the Führer made his first expansionist move. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saarland district on the French border, after it voted to return from League of Nations to German rule. A year later, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, part of Germany which had been demilitarized at Versailles. At the time, many felt that Hitler was only claiming back what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France objected. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis were seen by many as firm but fair. A government which was restoring the nation's pride and which didn't threaten anyone. Of course, there were signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws forbade Jews to marry true Aryan Germans and deprived them of their citizenship. But when the first threats came to world peace, they didn't come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Japan, at the start of the 20th century, was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in a war in 1905, and it had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was an acknowledged world power, and it signed up to the League of Nations. But politically, it was a mess of contradictions. Nominally a democracy, the feudal tradition was still strong. Most Japanese revered their emperor as a living god and regarded him as their true leader. And the country faced major economic problems. Its population was exploding. And it had no natural resources to fuel its rapidly expanding industries. Its leaders needed solutions, and they saw them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields, with plenty of coal and minerals. It was a perfect target. Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other possible targets were the colonies ruled by the European powers: Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, controlled by Britain; Indochina, ruled by France; and the Dutch East Indies. But at this stage, Japan had to be cautious. They didn't want to rouse the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist slogans, the US actually ran an unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under its direct rule. It undoubtedly had the strength to take on Japan, but since the end of World War I, it had had other distractions. This was America's Jazz Age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation concentrated on exploiting its vast resources. There was an economic boom that seemed without end. Fortunes were made both in industry and the stock markets. America seemed lost to the increasing pursuit of pleasure. With distractions like these, Japan's growing pains in the Pacific seemed very far away. America had slashed its army after World War I and agreed a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This, in effect, handed naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese. And then came the Great Depression. As the economic devastation spread, a quarter of the population lost their jobs. Tens of thousands were made homeless, living in shantytowns. Whereas before it had been distracted by pleasure, now America was distracted by pain. It was time for Japan to make her move. In 1931, without even informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital Mukden and then overran the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet ruler. Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been deposed in 1911, was dragged out of retirement.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first great test. Japan was universally condemned. But her response was blunt.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it didn't care. Its leaders had turned their eyes to further conquests in China. These were easy pickings. China was in a state of chaos. The government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in conflict with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. There was civil war. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, the Japanese signed a pact with Hitler. The aim was to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia were it to move on China. Then in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and invaded. At first, the Chinese were taken by surprise. But they soon fought back fiercely, the Communists even joining the Kuomintang in a united front. The Japanese responded with amphibious landings. And by the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China and the coast. The Japanese fought this war with exceptional brutality, bombing cities indiscriminately. Westerners living in the commercial center, the port of Shanghai, were now evacuated. The city was then besieged for 3 months. It suffered widespread damage, the Japanese forces showing no pity or concern for the native population. But it was after the capture of Nanking, then the Chinese capital, on December the 17th, 1937, that the Japanese forces really ran amok. Over 300,000 civilians are estimated to have been massacred during a 6-week orgy of rape and indiscriminate killing. The Japanese even attacked British and US warships which had been sent to protect their shipping and trade. The worst incident came on December the 12th, 1937. The American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crewmen died. Despite this, the Western powers refused to intervene. So the League of Nations could do nothing. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade of Japan.
It has become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world have far-reaching effects on us.
But the British would have none of it, fearing that it might provoke a war. So all Roosevelt could offer was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to buy arms. Even though the communists were now fighting alongside the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union did little to help either. Its only involvement was a series of clashes along its own border with Manchuria. But China itself received nothing. Instead, it had to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese overran Canton and pushed the Chinese forces deeper into the west of the country. All the rhetoric of the League of Nations, all those promises to stop international aggression, had come to nothing. And by now, the Western powers were facing aggression much closer to home.
Deve cristallizzare una posizione di potente ingiustizia. Sangue i principi che sorgono e che nascono e i principi che declinano, la vittoria è per noi, per i primi.
Today, it is easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All that posturing seems faintly ridiculous now, but it didn't seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy had seemed to be on the edge of anarchy. The country was riven by strikes and land seizures. The democratic government, just as in Germany, seemed powerless in the face of such unrest. So Benito Mussolini, a war veteran and a journalist, decided to take a stand. He organized a right-wing nationalist party, the Fascists. With the country paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. Fearing a civil war, Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel, asked him to form a government.
Si realizzassero le premesse necessarie e sufficienti per una collaborazione delle quattro grandi potenze occidentali,
Mussolini swiftly stamped out any political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers.
deve cristallizzare una posizione di potente ingiustizia.
By 1928, his position seemed secure. Parliament was appointed rather than elected, and all power was firmly in the hands of the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler, Mussolini's first acts made him immensely popular. Massive programs of public works provided employment and transformed Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was rooted out and the mafia more or less eliminated. Italy's armed forces were built up, including an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini launched a powerful navy, bigger than the combined might of the British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression came, Italy seemed to weather it better than most. Mussolini became a source of worldwide inspiration. Political leaders, not least Adolf Hitler in Germany, saw the fascist system as a role model, strong and purposeful, in contrast to the weakness of the democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini wanted more than adulation. He wanted to recreate the Roman Empire, and he already had a target in mind for his first imperial land grab. His target was Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. Italy already had colonies on its borders in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis in the Ogaden region, well inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini then sent reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding that Abyssinia pay reparations. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, appealed in person to the League of Nations. He called on it to live up to its ideals. Here was a small nation under threat from another member of the League. This was the supreme test. But the League did nothing. Britain's Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden, at least tried to broker a peace deal, but Mussolini would have none of it. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The primitive Abyssinian forces stood little chance against a modern army equipped with artillery and tanks. The Italian Air Force had total command of the air and harried the Abyssinians, on occasions dropping gas bombs, even though gas had been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun. The Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands. It did impose economic sanctions, but they had little effect. Mussolini's aggression had revealed two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, was impotent. And both Europe's supposed major powers, the democracies Britain and France, no longer had the stomach for a fight. Both Britain and France had been shattered by World War I, and their economies had never really recovered. Both had witnessed waves of strikes and unrest. Both had suffered mass unemployment, even before the Great Depression. Both also faced the cost of controlling empires, now swollen by taking on Germany's former colonies and the Middle Eastern territories once run by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And above all, both had been traumatized by the horrific casualties of World War I. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and above all Stanley Baldwin, all resolved to keep Britain out of future conflicts. Despite horrific casualties on the Western Front, Britain had ended World War I with a large and very effective conscript army. This was immediately run down to a small professional force designed to police its sprawling empire. And when the Great Depression struck, any ideas of modernizing the army were abandoned. It meant that Britain went into the run-up to war economically and militarily weak. French losses during World War I had been even worse than the British. Ever mistrustful of the Germans, a large conscript army was maintained. But throughout the 1920s, France's birth rate had declined. It became clear that there would be a manpower shortage by the mid to late 1930s. France realized it could never compete with Germany on the size of its army alone. The solution was to adopt an entirely defensive mentality. The Maginot Line, a series of fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the frontier with Germany and ran as far as the Belgian border. There, it theoretically linked up with fortifications planned by the Belgians. This new French military approach meant that France was only capable of waging a defensive war. It just did not have the ability to launch an attack on Italy, even if the British had had the troops to help. And of course, both countries knew that their navies in the Mediterranean were outnumbered by Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy conquered Abyssinia, it made sense for both powers to do nothing. It just seemed too remote, too much someone else's problem. By now, they both had to deal with all the traumas of the Great Depression. That seemed so much more pressing. And above all, they were now faced with a military threat far closer to home. A resurgent and rearming Germany. And Germany's power, and that of Italy too, was soon about to be demonstrated in supporting the rise of another dictator in Spain. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain. It was exceptionally vicious, setting family against family, communist against fascist, believers against atheists. In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power determined to get rid of the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. The king was forced into exile and a republic was declared. In February 1936, the parties of the left combined in a popular front to take on the forces of the right in a general election. The Popular Front won narrowly. Even though its reform program was modest, a wave of strikes and land seizures led the right to fear that a communist takeover was inevitable. Within the Spanish army, long a bastion of conservative and Catholic thinking, senior officers began to consider the possibility of a coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, a former chief of staff who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July the 17th, 1936, the units of the army fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony in Morocco mutinied. The next day, Franco flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement which would save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons now joined this revolt. The Popular Front responded by calling for volunteers to defend the Republic. Battle lines had been drawn. At first, Franco faced problems. He and his army were in North Africa, and he had to get across the Straits of Gibraltar back to Spain. So he turned to the one person he thought might help: Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's new Luftwaffe had begun an airlift, taking Franco's battle-hardened veterans over to southern Spain. At this stage, the Republic still seemed to have the advantage. The pro-Franco military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed, leaving it in control of most of the east of the country. Franco's nationalists were confined largely to the northwest and part of the south. But the nationalist situation was transformed when Hitler and Mussolini started to pour in troops and weapons. The German dictator seized the opportunity to test his new equipment and expanding armed forces. The first panzer tanks were sent, along with some 12,000 troops. And the Luftwaffe deployed its Condor Legion, with its ultra-modern new bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. In vain did the Republicans appeal to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. But London and Paris were scared of setting off a European war. They declared a policy of non-intervention. Cynically, both Germany and Italy signed up to this. But when it became obvious that they were still sending arms to the nationalists, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, announced that he would help the Republic. Stalin's worry was the rise of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it abundantly clear that he believed communism to be Nazism's ultimate enemy. Stalin saw the Spanish conflict as a way of keeping Germany and Italy occupied while building up the Soviet Union's military strength. About 700 military advisors were sent, along with tanks and fighter aircraft. It was something, but no match for the support Franco had received. In fact, the largest source of outside help for the Republic didn't come from a country at all, but from volunteers, the international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans signed up to fight in Spain. With their new fascist support, the nationalists were able to open two fronts, one advancing towards Barcelona from the north, the other led by Franco, pushing up towards Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was enveloped on three sides and virtually under siege. The fighting was intense and often accompanied by appalling atrocities against civilians. The Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists slaughtered anyone accused of being communist. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets. Madrid was heavily bombed. But the worst incident came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was virtually obliterated, with 6,000 civilian deaths. The area controlled by the Republic was steadily ground down. Its forces fought with great gallantry, but undertrained and under-equipped amateurs were no match for the professional soldiers led by Franco, or for the combined modern weaponry of Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the fighting around Madrid became a symbol of the left's determination not to be crushed by a fascist dictatorship. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was falling apart. The communists and socialists wanted to concentrate on winning a military victory. But the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as an opportunity for a mass revolution by the workers. These disagreements burst out into the open in May 1937. Fighting broke out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists. It was a fatal weakening of the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had penned their enemy into a small enclave around Barcelona, and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid continued to hold out, but the international brigades were withdrawn. More and more nations began to recognize Franco's government as his forces closed in for the final assault on Madrid. At the end of March 1939, its defenders, exhausted after nearly 3 years of fighting, the capital finally surrendered. A month later, Franco formally declared hostilities at an end. The scars of Spain's civil war took years to heal, and in some ways, they never have. And internationally, Franco's victory over the Republic proved a disaster. Hitler and Mussolini were confirmed in their belief that the democracies of Britain and France were impotent to resist any real pressure. while Stalin despaired of their willingness to confront fascism. Hitler in particular saw his way open to begin the aggressive policies outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were on the march. From the moment he became Chancellor of Germany on January the 30th, 1933, Hitler had begun to put his long-term ambitions into action. On February the 3rd, he told his top commanders that his ultimate aim was to conquer territory in the east and ruthlessly Germanize it. They were instructed to prepare for a massive expansion. Although Germany had been forbidden tanks, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed the development of tank designs and experimentation with new mobile armored tactics. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian read the theories of British thinkers like Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even watched exercises being carried out by the British during the 1920s on Salisbury Plain. It was from these that they came up with the idea of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery and infantry that could thrust fast and deep into enemy territory. Hitler adopted their ideas with enthusiasm. The new army was to have 3 panzer divisions. Similarly, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under former World War I fighter ace Hermann Goering, had had a framework to build on. Throughout the years in which its Air Force was officially banned, Germany had kept up its design skills by building civilian machines, and gliding and flying clubs provided a reserve of potential aircraft. Hitler revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935. He then announced that the army was to be increased to 300,000 men and conscription was reintroduced. Britain and France protested feebly at this flagrant breach of the Versailles Treaty. But soon, they reluctantly and slowly began to rearm. Until this point, Hitler had been modest in his goals. He had only taken back what was his, the Rhineland and Saarland. But now he had a grander target in mind, his homeland, Austria. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had attempted to seize power and unify the country with Germany. The Austrians, after all, spoke German, even if they had never been part of a German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was discovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop mistreating the Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany.
Die Jugend ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit Leibesfehlen.
Schuschnigg promptly called a referendum so that the Austrians could vote on whether to remain independent. But on March the 12th, 1938, the eve of the referendum, Hitler, fearing that it might produce the wrong result, sent in his troops. Complete surprise and an enthusiastic welcome by Nazi sympathizers made it a bloodless invasion. Within hours, Hitler announced Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich. The sovereign nation had, for the first time, been subsumed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to react. In the summer of 1938, he turned on his next prey, Czechoslovakia. A substantial German minority lived in the northwest of the country, an area known as the Sudetenland. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the old Austrian Empire, but had been cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919. This was the time bomb that had started ticking at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler encouraged Sudeten German demands for autonomy and then threatened the Czech government with force if it refused to agree. Undaunted, the Czech government ordered general mobilization and prepared to resist. The Czechoslovak army was large and well equipped, with formidable fortifications on its frontier with Germany. Hitler backed off. But then at the beginning of September, concerned that war might be imminent, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to act as a peacemaker. He flew to meet Hitler twice. The Nazi dictator assured him that if he could have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. In Munich, on September the 29th, 1938, with Mussolini acting as mediator, France and Britain signed an agreement giving the Sudetenland to Germany in return for a formal declaration by Hitler that he had no more territorial ambitions. Chamberlain flew back to Britain waving the piece of paper, which he claimed guarantees peace in our time. And so, on October the 1st, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and seized the Czech frontier fortifications. Hitler now began sizing up his next target, Poland.
Eine große Nation muss dauernd zusehen, wie gegen Recht und vertragliche Bestimmungen Angehörige Blut.
Again, the nominal cause was a German minority marooned as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler demanded the return of the port of Danzig to German control, so that East Prussia could be linked up with the rest of Germany. The Poles refused, and Hitler hesitated. He was not quite ready for all-out war, and he had unfinished business with Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, the eastern part of the country, Slovakia, which was ethnically different to the Czech lands, appealed to Hitler for help in achieving greater independence. Hitler summoned the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hácha to Berlin and browbeat him into putting his country under German protection. German troops now marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, unopposed. Most of the country was annexed into the Reich. Slovakia was declared a protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized non-German-speaking territory. But again, there was only a feeble protest from Britain and France. At the end of March, he again repeated his demand that Poland give up Danzig. This time, France and Britain declared unequivocally that they would declare war if he attacked Poland. But by now, Hitler cared little whether they did or not. He was sure that they would be weak and indecisive opponents. In Russia, Stalin had also become increasingly concerned by Hitler's aggression. In April, Stalin proposed an alliance with Britain and France. But negotiations made little progress. And finally, Stalin despaired, deciding that there was another solution to the German threat. On August the 23rd, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, who everyone had believed were sworn enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The agreement secretly specified that Poland would be split between the two countries, and Stalin would have a free hand to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now free from any Russian threat, Hitler ordered his armed forces to prepare for an immediate invasion. On the evening of August the 31st, the German Wehrmacht prepared for the assault. Its Führer had made the decision which would plunge the world into war.
During the afternoon of August 31st, 1939, German forces made their final preparations for the invasion of Poland. Air crews studied their targets. Tanks moved to their assault positions. Then, in the early hours of September the 1st, German soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a radio station on the German side of the border, leaving behind some bodies. This was the aggression which Hitler later used to justify his attack. At 8 that morning, German troops pushed aside the Polish frontier barriers and mobile forces raced forward. Two days later, on September the 3rd, Britain and France declared war, honoring their promise to stand by Poland. But by then, the Poles were in deep trouble. They were not only outnumbered, but facing a new form of warfare for which they were ill-prepared. Blitzkrieg. In 1939, the German army consisted of 1.5 million men. Its elite were the panzers, tanks, 6 armored divisions and 4 light divisions intended for reconnaissance, a total of 2,400 tanks. These had been designed to break through an enemy's defenses and strike deep, cutting communications and spreading confusion. Enemy strong points would be bypassed, left to the following infantry to mop up. The new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was also designed for Blitzkrieg. It had 2,500 aircraft lined up against the Poles.
The most notorious was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. It was a form of flying artillery, making pinpoint attacks in support of the fast-moving ground forces.
The Poles could muster just 600 planes. On the ground, it was just as bad. Poland's army was just 500,000 strong. It had only 880 tanks. It even had 11 brigades of cavalry, lances and horses against army. But it wasn't just numbers that gave the Germans their advantage. They used their panzers in a radically new way, as separate, hard-striking units. The Polish tanks were dispersed to support their infantry. The Poles' task had been made even more difficult by the German takeover of Czechoslovakia. The west of the country, including the capital Warsaw, was now surrounded on 3 sides by German-controlled territory. This geographical advantage was essential to Germany's grand plan. The task of the first thrust of the tanks was to create an initial breakthrough. But actually winning the war depended on deep pincer movements designed to surround and crush the enemy. These would come from Army Group North under General Fedor von Bock. He would launch 2 thrusts from northeast Germany and East Prussia. Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt would launch 2 more from Silesia and Slovakia. The aim would be for the pincers to meet near Warsaw and Brest-Litovsk. From the start, it went well for the Germans. The Polish Air Force was effectively eliminated within the first 2 days. Panzers cut through and struck deep. And the Stukas and medium bombers proved devastatingly effective. The Poles were sliced apart, pinned into pockets which yielded vast numbers of prisoners. Legend has it that some Polish cavalry units gallantly tried to attack the panzers, but it was futile. They were just brushed aside. By September the 8th, the inner pincers had met up. German troops were advancing on the outskirts of Warsaw. On September the 17th, the outer pincers met at Brest-Litovsk. On the same day, Soviet forces crossed the eastern Polish frontier as part of the agreement reached between Hitler and Stalin in the Nazi-Soviet pact. The Polish army was now in full retreat, its government fleeing abroad. Warsaw, however, fought on. Its defenders rejected a German offer to surrender, so the full fury of the German war machine was turned on it. Watching it all was Adolf Hitler, who had followed close behind his conquering army. On September the 27th, Warsaw surrendered. The next day, the victors carved Poland up according to the Nazi-Soviet pact. The Soviet Union annexed slightly over half the country to the east. Germany took the rest. Both regimes began rounding up anyone who might present a danger in future. Many were murdered. And for the first time, the Germans revealed how they would behave against those peoples in Eastern Europe whom they considered inferior. They sent in the Einsatzgruppen, special SS squads, to round up Jews. Most were forced into ghettos in the major cities, where they would be starved to death. Others were executed on the spot. This was not, however, the end of the Polish army. More than 50,000 troops escaped and eventually reached France. There, a provisional government had been formed by General Władysław Sikorski, the Poles would fight on bravely from abroad. In Britain, the air raid sirens had sounded within minutes of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's announcement that hostilities had begun. In fact, despite their politicians' guarantees of Polish sovereignty, Britain and France had done very little to help Poland. As Hitler had gambled, they had no idea what to do once they had actually declared war. Both countries had begun mobilization. Air raid precautions were speeded up. Anti-aircraft guns were placed in major cities. Shelters were erected. Soon, children were being evacuated. Everyone had to carry gas masks, and a blackout was introduced. The British Army began to deploy its 100,000-strong expeditionary force to northern France. French troops did advance a little way inside the German border, but they refused to move beyond the protective cover of artillery range. The initiative was still firmly in Hitler's hands. And he at least knew precisely what he was going to do next. The Blitzkrieg against Poland had been a stunning success for Adolf Hitler. He had subdued an entire country in less than 4 weeks, and he was hungry for more. So he ordered his generals to plan to attack the British and French in November 1939, less than 2 months after the fall of Poland. His general staff was appalled. The bulk of the German army was still out east and had to be moved west. And there had been some serious losses in the Polish campaign. Lessons had to be learned. Polish anti-tank guns had destroyed a division's worth of the lightly armored panzers. A quarter of the aircraft used had been lost. The panzers were too light and unreliable, and they had frequently outrun both their supply columns and the marching infantry. Reluctantly, after furious arguments, Hitler agreed to wait until the following spring. Meanwhile, his enemies were also learning lessons. Britain had thought that bombers would be a key weapon in the coming conflict. But when on September the 4th, Britain's Royal Air Force made a daylight raid on German shipping, 7 of the 30 bombers were shot down. It soon became clear that this wasn't a one-off misfortune. In some raids, over half the aircraft were lost. British bombers just weren't up to the job. So the RAF switched to night raids, and they decided to drop not bombs but leaflets, so as not to provoke retaliation. So, with the Blitzkrieg stalled and the air war quiet, the focus now went to the one remaining arena, the sea. Germany's navy was still in the middle of an ambitious building program that wasn't due to finish until 1948. The commander of its submarine arm, Admiral Karl Dönitz, planned to cut Britain's supply routes across the Atlantic. For this, he wanted 300 ocean-going submarines, but he had just 38. Nevertheless, Dönitz ensured that all available U-boats were at sea on September the 3rd, the first day of the war against Britain. That evening, believing it to be an armed merchant cruiser, U-30 sank the liner Abyssinia without any warning. A 112 lives were lost, including 26 American citizens. The Royal Navy dwarfed its German counterpart. It had 12 battleships. Germany had none. It had 5 aircraft carriers, Germany, again, had none. So after the Abyssinia, Britain declared a total blockade of German ports. But for all its size, the Royal Navy had too few escort vessels. Many merchant ships had to sail alone. And by the end of 1939, more than 100 had been sunk. It quickly became apparent that the British had woefully underestimated the submarine threat. On September the 17th, U-29 sank the British aircraft carrier Courageous. On October the 14th, the battleship Royal Oak was sunk when U-47 slipped through the defences of the British main fleet base at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. Meanwhile, Germany's small surface fleet had also been unleashed against the sea lanes. In the North Sea, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau intercepted a convoy on November the 22nd. They sank its escort, the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. But it was the pocket battleship Graf Spee which caused the greatest problems. Designed specifically for commerce raiding, its 11-inch guns could overwhelm any ship fast enough to overtake it, and it had the speed to escape from any battleship. The Graf Spee had slipped away from Germany before hostilities began. Soon it was cutting loose in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Finally, 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax and Achilles, intercepted it off the River Plate on the east coast of South America. The British ships damaged the pocket battleship so badly that it had to take refuge in the neutral Uruguayan port of Montevideo. The Germans were then fooled into thinking that a more powerful British force had arrived. When the Graf Spee was commanded to leave port, her captain scuttled her rather than risk annihilation. Back home, the Royal Navy crews were feted as heroes. But this was just about the only obvious success enjoyed by the British or French armed forces during the winter of 1939. Though the British did enjoy one secret victory in the technological war, which was to prove vital. As soon as the war began, Britain began to lose large numbers of ships to German mines. What was so mysterious was that the ships didn't seem to have actually struck them. The mines had simply exploded as the ships passed nearby. Then, on the night of November the 22nd, 1939, a German plane was spotted dropping a mine at low tide in the Thames estuary. Disarmed and rescued from the mud, the mine was found to be set off by the magnetic signature of a ship passing close by. The solution was to reduce a ship's magnetic signature by hanging a copper cable round the hull and then passing an electric current through it, a process called degaussing. Once degaussing was applied to all ships, the danger from the magnetic mine was massively reduced. But otherwise, as 1940 began, the war was quiet. The two sides did little during the winter except to patrol, train, and try to keep warm, for it was a particularly cold one. An American journalist called it the phony war. For the Germans, it was the Sitzkrieg. In the spring, the British Expeditionary Force took up its position towards the left of the front on the Belgian border. but it was dwarfed by its French ally. France had some 100 divisions along the Belgian and German frontiers or in reserve nearby. This imbalance meant that the British commander, Lord Gort, had to go along with the ideas of the French general Maurice Gamelin. And these were entirely defensive. French hopes were pinned on the massive ramparts of the Maginot Line. A series of fortifications, it ran from Switzerland to Belgium along the French-German border. The Maginot Line was considered to be completely impassable and would ensure that French territory remained safe. But otherwise, the Allies had no idea of how actually to defeat Germany. Instead, they brought up their forces and prepared for a repeat of World War I. They would blockade Germany to sap its strength, and they would dig in, ready to grind down the assault which they knew must come. None of their commanders seemed to consider that the Germans might have totally different ideas, or that the next moves might come in a completely different arena. Scandinavia. On November the 30th, 1939, a new theatre of war was opened up. The Soviet Union invaded its tiny neighbor, Finland. Finland had only achieved independence from the Russians in 1918 and hated them. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was convinced that one day the Finns might allow the Germans in to attack Leningrad and the vital Arctic port of Murmansk. The Red Army outnumbered its Finnish opponents by more than 10 to 1. The invasion should have been a walkover. But its leadership had been devastated by Stalin's terrible purges. The Finns were led by General Gustav Mannerheim. He fought back using hit-and-run tactics amid the deep snow, often on skis. The Soviet troops, confused and poorly led, suffered massive losses. Finland's gallant resistance caught the imagination of the British and French. Soon they were planning to send help via Norway and Sweden. The fact that this might suck two neutral countries into the war was ignored. But a renewed Soviet offensive at the beginning of February broke the Finnish defensive line. In early March, the Finns had to cede territory to Stalin. By now, Hitler too had become interested in Scandinavia. The Nazi war machine relied on iron ore from Sweden. In the winter months, the only way it could get to Germany was via the Norwegian port of Narvik. If the Allies landed in Norway, this vital supply could be cut off. So he ordered plans to be prepared for an invasion of Norway. Denmark, which was in the way, would also have to be seized. The Norway theatre heated up on February the 16th, 1940. The British destroyer Cossack boarded the German supply ship Altmark in a Norwegian fjord to release prisoners. Then, on April the 9th, German troops began landing at 5 ports: Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. At the same time, men of their newly formed German parachute division seized Stavanger and Oslo airfields. The Norwegian defenders were swiftly overwhelmed, as were the Danes. German forces occupied their country within 24 hours. In Norway, the Germans moved swiftly to link up their beachheads and seize all the major towns. In the air, the Luftwaffe had total control. The Allies now responded. A landing force was dispatched to recapture Narvik. French and Norwegian forces achieved this on May the 28th. But a substantial German force was now approaching. So 6 weeks later, the Allies abandoned Norway to its fate. Hitler had spent most of that winter and spring at his country retreat, the Berghof in southern Bavaria. For him, the events in Scandinavia were a sideshow. Instead, he was preparing for his next major Blitzkrieg against Britain and France. The first plan his generals brought him had a familiar ring to it. The Germans would advance into Belgium, aiming to swing down towards Paris. It was a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans had used at the start of World War I. The Allies were expecting this, and their main strategic discussion was how to prepare for it. When the Germans attacked, the Allies planned that their forces west of the Maginot Line would swing forward into Belgium to hold them on the shorter and more defensible line of the rivers Dyle and Meuse. Then, on January the 10th, 1940, a German liaison aircraft lost its way and crashed in Belgium. A copy of the German plan was found. This convinced the Allies that their Dyle plan must be right, and they deployed their troops accordingly. Unfortunately, the same event made the Germans alter their ideas entirely. Chief planner General Erich von Manstein had always thought the original plan unimaginative. He was worried that the German forces would become bogged down, as in World War I, and that his country would lose a long, drawn-out war. So he proposed to Hitler that the main thrust should be made at the point where the Maginot Line ended, and where the Allies were most vulnerable as their Western armies moved forward. Virtually all Germany's panzers would be gathered opposite the Ardennes in southeast Belgium. The Allies considered this hilly and wooded area almost impassable for tanks. It was, therefore, lightly defended. The plan was to drive deep behind the Allied armies, which would have advanced into Belgium. They could then cut them off, and all the forces sitting in the Maginot Line would be bypassed. It was a high-risk strategy. The German armor could become stuck in the forest, but Hitler loved it. So the German forces were redeployed without the Allies knowing. The Allies, meanwhile, prepared for their long defensive war. In addition to the formidable barrier of the Maginot Line, they had a slight advantage both in manpower, some 110 divisions available against 95 German, and in armor, about 3,000 vehicles against 2,700. The French also had the better tanks. Their 32-ton Char Bay had both 75 and 47mm guns. Its disadvantage was that the main gun was mounted in the hull, and so was difficult to aim. The other gun was in a one-man turret, from which the commander had to control the tank as well as man the gun. In contrast, the newest German design, the 17-ton Panzer Mark IV, had a 75mm gun in a spacious three-man turret, so its crew could work as a team, though only about 100 were available. The other main French tanks also had guns which matched those of their German counterparts, but again the French had the one-man turret. The one area where the Germans had a clear advantage was in the air. The Luftwaffe had 2,000 bombers, the Allies just 800. The Luftwaffe had 4,000 fighters, including the ultra-modern Messerschmitt Bf 109. They faced just 2,500, mainly older aircraft. The Royal Air Force did have about 800 excellent Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, but it was keen to keep them for home defense. But the main difference between the two armies was in philosophy. Everything the Germans did was focused on the possibilities of Blitzkrieg. All their armor was grouped in 10 independent panzer divisions. But the French were preparing for a repeat of the static fighting of World War I. They saw tanks as infantry support and distributed them piecemeal instead of concentrating them. They had noticed the success of Germany's panzers in Poland, so they were assembling 3 armored divisions. But by the start of hostilities, none was fully operational. 2 totally different ways of military thinking were about to go head-to-head. Blitzkrieg against static warfare. The summer of 1940 would soon show which was correct. On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain. He couldn't have picked a worse day. That was the day Hitler chose to launch his Blitzkrieg against France and Britain. At dawn, a whole German airborne division parachuted into Holland to seize bridges and airfields. Simultaneously, the massive Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael was assaulted. Paratroop engineers were dropped on top by swooping German gliders. They swiftly silenced its guns. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe attacked Dutch and Belgian air bases. Then the frontier barriers were pushed aside. And Hitler's Army Group B, under General Fedor von Bock, now drove into Holland and Belgium. As planned, the French and British armies along the Belgian border moved forward to their new defensive line along the Dyle and Meuse rivers. But none of the Allied commanders seemed to have noticed that German Army Group A, which had the bulk of the panzers, after brushing aside the Belgian frontier troops, had now begun driving through the hills and woods of the Ardennes to their south. Meanwhile, the Germans were pushing rapidly through Holland. The obsolete Dutch army was no match for the highly tuned German war machine. And it was under continual heavy air attack by the Luftwaffe, which roamed the skies unchallenged. On May the 14th, the Germans demanded the surrender of the port of Rotterdam. A large force of bombers took off as the Dutch hesitated. While they were airborne, the Dutch agreed to surrender the city, but apparently a recall message never reached the bombers. Rotterdam was devastated. The Dutch capitulated the next day. Then came the hammer blow. The thing that British and French planners had thought impossible had happened. German panzers were through the Ardennes and had reached the Meuse by the evening of May the 12th. Among the first to arrive at Sedan, well north of the Maginot Line, were the men of the 19th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, fresh from the triumphs in Poland. Guderian now showed how Blitzkrieg should be done. he ignored the troops in the Maginot Line, and he didn't wait for his own infantry to catch up. He pushed straight on. The next day, assault troops crossed the River Meuse. Engineers began building bridges for the armor while under heavy French fire. On the 14th, the panzers began crossing. That evening, Guderian's bridgehead was 8 miles deep. The French troops, stuck in the Maginot Line, were too immobile to intervene. Allied bombers made despairing attempts to destroy the German bridges. But most were shot down. All the while, German artillery pounded the French defenses while the Stukas screamed in. Just 3 days after the attack had been launched, the French defenders around Sedan broke. Guderian's panzers began racing westwards. By nightfall, they had advanced more than 40 miles behind the northern group of Allied armies. These had been holding firm on the Dial line, but now the French Supreme Commander, General Gamelin, realized that they were about to be encircled. He ordered them to fall back. This sudden decision to withdraw bewildered the Allied troops, who had no idea what was going on behind them. As they fell back, they were hindered by a growing flood of refugees clogging the roads. That day, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud phoned Churchill. He said, "We are beaten. We have lost the battle." But for all the brilliance of the Blitzkrieg, the Germans were vulnerable. As the panzers raced westwards, they created an ever longer corridor just a few miles wide. The Allies realized that this was open to counterattack. The bulk of the German army was still totally dependent on horsepower or its own feet for transport, so the gap between the rampaging panzers and the follow-up infantry grew with every hour. On May the 17th, Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commander of one of the newly formed French armored divisions, made the first of 2 attempts to cut through the German line near Crécy. But the cumbersome French command system meant that units were sent into battle piecemeal, not in a coordinated thrust. The Germans had little difficulty warding off both attacks, inflicting heavy casualties. It seemed that nothing could now stop Guderian. He plunged on, further and further into France. By the 19th, his lead units were past Péronne. On the 20th, in an extraordinary 56-mile dash, Amiens had been taken by lunchtime. Abbeville, just 14 miles from the English Channel, was seized by 9 that evening. And at midnight, a battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the coast at Noyelles. The Germans had split the Allied front in 2. Everything now depended on whether they could defend this long, thin corridor, or whether the Allies could successfully counterattack. So now the British got ready to break the German lines. On May the 21st, 2 armoured battalions prepared to launch an attack south of Arras. The British tanks were even more unsuited to fast-moving armoured warfare than the French. Their most effective machine, the Matilda II, had been designed for infantry support. Though well armoured, it was slow and undergunned. The Germans had little trouble in repulsing the attack. But it did have an effect. By now, the German High Command were becoming worried by their extended lines of communication. So, for the time being, driving south into the rest of France was put on hold until the infantry had caught up. The priority was to turn north and eliminate the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army fighting beside it. On May the 22nd, Guderian and the Panzers began their attack to destroy the Allied armies. These were now pulling back to the ports of Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk, but they were trapped. On May the 23rd, General Alan Brooke, commander of British II Corps, wrote, "Nothing but a miracle can save the British Expeditionary Force." 2 days later, the Germans seized Boulogne. It was beginning to look as if even a miracle would be too late. May the 25th, 1940. The situation of the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army was desperate. The port of Boulogne had been overrun. German troops had isolated Calais. The British were being forced back to the port of Dunkirk. Lord Gort, the British commander, advised his government that the only hope of saving even a fraction of his troops was to organize an evacuation by sea. But as the dive bombers screamed down and the panzers were poised for the final assault, evacuation seemed a forlorn hope. The British anticipated that Dunkirk would be overrun within a day. But unknown to the British, Hitler and the German High Command had made a decision which was to save them from total annihilation. The Germans were only too aware that their panzer crews were exhausted and their machines needed urgent repairs. Those attacks by de Gaulle and the British may have failed, but they have shown very clearly how vulnerable the German lines of communication were. This was the great weakness of Blitzkrieg. So the High Command made a fateful decision. It decided to stop the panzers' advance to save them from further damage and wait for the infantry to come up. Only then would the Allied pocket around Dunkirk be eliminated. So the Blitzkrieg was halted and the panzers lay idle. They would not advance for 2 days, just enough to buy the British in particular a little time to prepare. As the tanks waited, the only major action was in Calais. There the British and French garrison refused to surrender. Instead, they had to be overrun in 3 days of bloody hand-to-hand fighting. When the panzers got going again 2 days later on May the 26th, the weather had changed. The Germans became bogged down in the heavy rain, again giving the Allies more time. So it was that at 7:57 p.m. on May the 26th, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, flag officer commanding Dover, received a signal that he was to put Operation Dynamo into action. Operation Dynamo was a plan to withdraw the British Expeditionary Force by sea. He had prepared it more in hope than expectation that it could ever be used. The following day, a makeshift fleet of destroyers, tugs, and passenger ferries crossed the English Channel. But But by the end of the day, less than 8,000 of the over 300,000 troops at Dunkirk had been rescued. The port was under such heavy air attack that it could not be used. And the ships could not get in close enough to the beaches. So Ramsay now sent out a call for any boats of shallow draft that were over 30 feet long. Hundreds of cabin cruisers, fishing boats and barges were gathered from harbours all over southern England and sent across the Channel, often crewed by their civilian owners. The little ships worked on the beaches of Dunkirk, ferrying troops out to the larger boats waiting to take them to safety. All the time they were under constant air attack. The British Air Force threw every fighter it possessed into the battle to drive the Luftwaffe off. Even so, 7 French and 6 British destroyers were sunk, together with 24 smaller warships. A quarter of the 665 small boats never got home. But when the evacuation was halted on June the 4th, over 300,000 men, 41% of them French, had been rescued. None of this would have been possible without the heroism of the French army. It played a vital role in slowing down the German advance. The French rearguard didn't leave its positions around Dunkirk until the last boats had pulled away from the beaches. One British officer compared them to the last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae. Even so, the British Army had lost most of its heavy weapons. It wouldn't be fit to fight the Germans again for a long time. France still had to fight on, but it had lost more than half its army. Against them, the Germans had 92 divisions, including masses of armor. At 4 in the morning of June the 5th, a short bombardment began the final destruction of France. Assault troops crossed the Somme and the Aisne. At first, the French resistance was fierce, and the Germans struggled to break out of their bridgeheads. But, once again, the Luftwaffe helped crush the defenses. Soon the panzers were pushing south, and the trickle of surrendering French troops turned into a flood. By the 9th, the panzers had reached the River Seine, and the infantry were only a few hours behind. Once across the river, the Germans fanned out into the interior of the country. On the 14th, the German army marched into Paris. The swastika was raised on the Eiffel Tower. Hitler had secured the prize which had eluded the Kaiser in 1914. The Parisians could only watch in stunned horror. Throughout the period of the French collapse, Winston Churchill paid 5 visits to France, trying to bolster French resistance. On June the 16th, he even offered Paul Reynaud a union with Britain if France stayed in the fight. But it was too late. Reynaud's cabinet rejected the proposal, and the Prime Minister resigned that evening. He was succeeded by Marshal Philippe Pétain, who immediately asked the Germans for an armistice. It was only now that the Germans finally began to attack the Maginot Line, which had been left isolated. After a heavy artillery bombardment, the French defenders offered only token resistance before the German troops occupied the forts. On June the 21st, Hitler went to Compiègne, where the railway carriage in which the Germans had signed the armistice in 1918 was kept. As a French delegation entered the carriage, he handed them his terms and then left. The French insisted on consulting their government, but the next day they were told that if they didn't sign immediately, the panzers would roll again. They signed, and the humiliation of France was complete. For Hitler, his control of Western Europe seemed absolute. He felt sure that Britain must now seek peace, and that soon he could turn to the next stage of his master plan. But even though the Blitzkrieg had achieved so much so fast, it hadn't won him the war. The British, battered and wounded, had escaped to fight another day.
On June the 22nd, 1940, Britain stood alone against the Nazis. France had surrendered, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill could only growl defiance.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
Britain still had all the resources of its vast empire. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and a host of other territories had all been quick to declare war on Germany. But they were thousands of miles away, across the oceans, and their military power could not be brought to bear where it mattered. Britain's situation seemed hopeless, and Hitler had no doubt that Britain would soon try to negotiate a peace. But Churchill quickly showed how determined he was prepared to be in the war against the Nazis. A powerful squadron of 2 French battleships and 2 battle cruisers was lying in the port of Mers el Kebir in French North Africa. If the French ships fell into German hands, the British Navy's position in the Mediterranean would become impossible. So on July the 3rd, a Royal Navy task force demanded that the French ships either join it or sail to a neutral port to be interned. The French refused. So the British opened fire on their former allies. They destroyed or severely damaged 3 of the battleships. Almost 1,300 French sailors were killed. But Churchill's ruthlessness didn't seem to impress Hitler. On July the 19th, he returned in triumph to Berlin and was greeted by more than 1 million people. That day, he made a speech in the Reichstag, the German parliament, offering peace terms to Britain. His offer seemed generous. Britain could keep its empire. In return, Hitler wanted a free hand in Europe. His plan was to conquer the countries of the East in order to win Lebensraum, room to live, for the German people. But Churchill would have none of it. The British would fight on. This would, as he put it, be their finest hour. Churchill's defiance was immensely popular. King George VI wrote in his diary, "Personally, I feel happier now that we have no more allies to be polite to and to pamper." But it was difficult to see how Britain could ever turn the tables and actually win the war. The British army might have survived Dunkirk, but it had lost almost all its tanks, artillery, and transport in the evacuation. It had just 25 divisions armed mainly with rifles to resist the vast armored columns of the world's most fearsome war machine. So there was little to be done except dig in and wait. Coastal defences were prepared and concrete strongpoints built all across southern England. Signposts on roads were removed to make it harder for any invaders to find their way around. Large open areas were littered with obstacles to deter airborne troops. A volunteer defence force, the Home Guard, was recruited. It was made up of men who were otherwise ineligible to fight, often because of their age. By the end of June 1940, almost 1.5 million volunteers had signed up. But there were few weapons with which to arm them. Hitler, meanwhile, was getting on with his invasion plans, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Some 20 divisions would be landed on a broad front along England's south coast. Barges were gathered from all over northwest Europe. These were hurriedly converted into makeshift landing craft. Troops were trained for beach landings. But for all Hitler's bravado, those planning Sea Lion were worried. Hitler might dismiss the English Channel as just another river to be crossed. But Britain's navy was still the largest in the world. It might be stretched thin by its worldwide commitments, but the Royal Navy's home fleet far outnumbered the German navy. The German naval chief, Admiral Erich Raeder, had no confidence that he could seize control of the English Channel for long enough to get the army across. But the Germans did have one area of apparent massive superiority. The Luftwaffe far outnumbered Britain's Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Göring, had little doubt that he could establish air control over the Channel long enough for Sea Lion to take place. On July the 10th, the Luftwaffe began attacking shipping in the Channel. In response, the British had 2 of the most outstanding of the new breed of single-engine, multi-gun monoplanes. The Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. The Spitfire was slightly faster and more agile than its German rival, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which escorted the German bombers. It would be used to intercept these. The Hurricane would prove a lethal bomber kill. But in July 1940, Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, had less than 700 fighters. Against them were 2,600 German fighters and bombers. The odds against the RAF were daunting. Dowding knew that he could not take on the Luftwaffe every time it came over the Channel. So when the Germans began hitting British shipping, he did nothing. Instead, he would only use the RAF to stop the Luftwaffe from establishing the air supremacy needed for invasion. So he would only take on its big attacks. To help him, the British had one crucial innovation: radar. By the 1930s, scientists in both Britain and Germany knew that objects well beyond human sight could be detected by bouncing radio pulses off them and measuring the time it took for the signals to return. In Britain, a team of scientists led by Robert Watson Watt began developing radar as a means of detecting approaching aircraft at long range. Their work was seized upon by Dowding. He made radar the core of the world's first integrated air defense system. Known as Chain Home, this was a string of 21 300-foot-tall radar masts sited along the south and east coasts of Britain. These could pick up aircraft at a range of 120 miles and give their distance, direction, height, and numbers. The information would be passed back to RAF Fighter Command's headquarters at Bentley Priory, just outside London. There, it would be assessed, and warning of an impending raid passed to Fighter Command's operations room.
Moonshine 1 for Sky Blue, take target 1, channel G George. Roger.
Controllers would then alert the nearest RAF airfields and scramble the necessary number of fighters. The question was, would radar make up for Germany's massive superiority in numbers? The stage was now set for what would become known as the Battle of Britain. Since June the 10th, 1940, the German Luftwaffe had been battering British shipping in the English Channel. The Luftwaffe's commander, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, was determined to lure the British Air Force into combat. But Britain's Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding refused to take the bait. He used his fighters sparingly, knowing that the real battle was still to come. As this first phase of the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe had a massive superiority in numbers. It had 1,100 single-engine fighters available to the Royal Air Force's 700. Almost all the German fighters were the excellent Messerschmitt Bf 109E, with a top speed of around 350 miles an hour. About two-thirds of the British fighters were Hawker Hurricanes, slower than the 109s but more agile. The remainder were Supermarine Spitfires, with a top speed similar to the 109s. For their assault, the Germans had over 1,300 medium bombers, Dornier Do-17s, Heinkel HE-111s, and Junkers Ju-88s, each carrying about 4,000 pounds of bombs. Göring selected August the 13th as Adlertag, Eagle Day, for the start of his main assault. His aim was to destroy RAF fighters in the air and the RAF's airfields and Britain's aircraft factories. Softening up attacks were made the day before. These concentrated on the airfields and the radar towers along the south coast. One station on the Isle of Wight was put out of action, and several were damaged, but these were working again within hours. Goering did not believe that radar had a significant role to play in the battle, and so these attacks were not repeated. It was a big mistake. At Le Tag dawned cloudy, so the main assault was postponed until the afternoon. When it came, radar gave ample warning.
Stalemate calling. Planes heard 3 miles southwest.
Nonetheless, most of the RAF airfields in the south were hammered. But by the end of the day, none had been put out of action. The Luftwaffe lost 46 aircraft. Britain, just 30. The Luftwaffe mounted its largest attack of the whole battle on August the 15th. Waves of heavily escorted German bombers forced their way through to the RAF airfields. The RAF was so overstretched that some pilots flew 7 sorties that day. By the time the raids died away, some 90 German aircraft had been shot down for the loss of 42 British fighters. The battle continued with equal ferocity over the next few days. Both sides became increasingly exhausted. Dowding tried to rotate his pilots to rest them, but he simply did not have enough of them. Many were being sent into battle with just 10 hours flying experience. The Luftwaffe was suffering too. Its pilots were shocked and increasingly demoralized by the resilience of the British. The RAF fighters always seemed to be waiting for them. As the fighting wore on for 12 solid days, the British losses began to creep up to match those of the Germans. The Royal Air Force was close to breaking. To turn the screw, Goering began using his bombers to attack at night as well. But this decision had an unexpected outcome. On the night of August the 24th, a flight of Heinkel bombers lost its way and bombed the city of London. It was the first attack on a non-military target. The next night, 81 British bombers responded by raiding Berlin. Hitler was infuriated and demanded massive retaliation. This came on the evening of September the 7th. German bombers attacked the London docks and surrounding areas. More than 450 people died, and thousands of homes were destroyed. But in fact, this was Goering's second crucial mistake. By switching from the RAF's airfields just at the moment when it seemed about to break, he gave it the respite it needed. Had Goering continued to attack the airfields, the RAF could not have continued to defend the skies. Instead, On September the 15th, British radars picked up another massive assault on London. The first wave of 100 bombers and 400 fighters was intercepted. Fighting raged all the way from the coast. In the afternoon, another fleet of 150 bombers renewed the attack. Winston Churchill was at Fighter Command headquarters that day. After he heard controllers calling in reinforcements from neighboring groups, he asked, "What other reserves have we got?" The reply was, "There are none." But it was obvious that the Luftwaffe had failed to gain control of the air. And on September the 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. The Battle of Britain did not really end, it died away. Hitler now tried a new tactic. By October the 5th, the daylight raids stopped, and the Germans concentrated on bombing Britain's cities by night. This was a so-called Blitz. London was attacked every night but one, up to November the 12th. On November the 10th, the centre of the city of Coventry was obliterated. The Blitz continued into 1941, with the last major raid being made on London on the night of May the 10th. More than 50,000 civilians were killed in the Blitz, but there was never any question of Britain cracking. Victory in the Battle of Britain was a moment of huge national relief. Pilots had come from all over the empire to join the RAF, and from countries occupied by the Nazis like Poland and Czechoslovakia. Churchill summed up the nation's gratitude.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
But for Hitler, this was no more than an irritating setback. Britain, he was convinced, could never be a serious threat. So he now turned to Eastern Europe. For Britain, there was now a chance to rebuild with a view one day to taking the fight to the enemy. But to do that, Churchill would need help. Britain may have won the Battle of Britain, but it was still immensely vulnerable. Night after night, its cities were hammered by the Nazis' Blitz. Its supply lifelines at sea were under constant assault. Churchill needed more help. And there was only one country that could provide it: the United States. By 1940, the US had recovered from the Great Depression and the economy was booming again. It had immense reserves of manpower and unrivaled industrial strength. But the people of the United States were utterly opposed to becoming involved yet again in Europe's wars. In July 1940, a poll showed that only 8% of them were willing to enter the war. Undeterred, Churchill lobbied the US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt had long admired Churchill for his outspokenly anti-Nazi views, and the two men shared an interest in naval affairs. Roosevelt had been Undersecretary for the US Navy in 1917. After he became president, Roosevelt kept in touch with Churchill. The two began a correspondence, Churchill signing himself former naval person. For all his avuncular image, Roosevelt had no illusions that German aggression would one day suck America into the war. So he began the long job of preparing American public opinion.
I am a pacifist, but I believe you and I will act together to protect and to defend our science, our culture, our American freedom, and our civilization.
In July 1940, he got approval for a massive expansion of the US Navy, including the building of 6 large battleships and a new class of aircraft carriers. The following month, Congress agreed that the National Guard and other reserves should be called up for 1 year's active duty. And in September, the large expansion of the 150,000-strong US Army was agreed, with a limited number of conscripts being chosen by lottery.
The first number drawn by the Secretary of War is serial number 158.
That same month, Roosevelt announced a deal under which the US would supply Britain with 50 World War I destroyers in return for 99-year leases on bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. The British Navy, desperate for more escorts to fight the U-boats, began taking them over within days of the deal being signed. The clearest sign that Roosevelt was slowly winning the argument came in the November 1940 presidential election, when he convincingly defeated the isolationist Wendell Willkie with 27 million votes to 22 million. At the end of the year, Roosevelt spoke to the American people, setting out the 4 essential freedoms which he believed were at stake and which Britain was fighting to uphold: freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from want and from fear. To save these, the United States must become the arsenal of the democracies. In other words, it must arm Britain.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
But some Americans remained implacably opposed to helping Britain. One of the most outspoken was the American ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president John F. Kennedy. A Boston Irish businessman who had made his fortune booze smuggling during Prohibition, Kennedy hated the British and seized every opportunity to claim that they would shortly be forced to surrender. However, Kennedy's virulence was counterbalanced by the growing admiration many Americans felt for the bravery shown by the British people during the Blitz. In particular, the broadcasts by the CBS London correspondent Ed Murrow helped to change public opinion.
This is London. I remember the evening of Sunday, December 29th. It was just like any other winter evening. The first bombers were over London at about 6:30. Soon the fires hissed from the top-story windows. Hitler once boasted, "I will rub out their cities." This is what he meant.
Encouraged by his electoral success, in January 1941, Roosevelt introduced his so-called Lend-Lease Bill. The United States would supply weapons and war material to Britain and China, which was still struggling desperately against the invading Japanese. Payment would be delayed. Roosevelt likened Lend-Lease to lending a neighbor a hose to put out a fire. He would worry about the payback later. Roosevelt was also being canny. It also meant that, unlike in 1917, if America had to enter the war, it already would have a substantial weapons industry. American war preparations didn't end there. Roosevelt secretly authorized US military staffs to discuss a common strategy with the British should America enter the war. By April 1941, he felt confident enough to take another step to help Britain at sea. He greatly extended the Pan-American Security Zone, the area within which US warships would protect US merchant vessels. In May, US troops set up bases in Greenland, and in July, US Marines were sent to replace the British garrison in Iceland, which was there to deprive the Germans of its harbors. The US Navy also began providing limited convoy escorts, particularly for US ships carrying Lend-Lease materials. Hitler now gave his submariners strict instructions not to sink American ships, as he didn't want to provoke the United States into war. But inevitably, there were clashes. On September the 4th, 1941, a British aircraft attacked a German submarine. Thinking that the strike had come from the nearby US destroyer Greer, the U-boat fired a torpedo at it. The Greer responded with depth charges, and there was a running battle which lasted 3 hours. Neither vessel was sunk, but the tension was mounting. On November the 17th, the destroyer USS Kearney was hit by a torpedo while on convoy duty off Iceland. The U-boat commander claimed it was an accident. He'd been firing at a British ship and Kearney had got in the way. But 11 US sailors were dead, and the destroyer only just made it back to port in Reykjavik. Roosevelt protested, and the US press was outraged. However, the American public remained resolutely opposed to going to war. Within weeks, at the end of 1941, the situation was reversed in a single day. But in the meantime, Britain would have to fight on alone. And luckily, it had an astonishing weapon to hand. It looks like just another mansion in the English countryside, a bit run down. But Bletchley Park once contained a secret that fundamentally affected the course of World War II. Because it was at Bletchley that Britain worked out how to read Germany's most secret codes. Since the mid-1930s, all the German armed forces and intelligence departments had adopted a standard machine for encoding their messages. The cipher machine E, better known as Enigma. It was developed in the early 1920s as a handy tool for businessmen to keep commercial messages secret. It was powered by a battery, and its encoded messages were transmitted in Morse code to be decoded on a second Enigma machine at the receiving end. The critical element of the machine was 3 rotors, which could be set to scramble the message in a way which could only be unscrambled by another machine with the same settings. The rotors could be replaced and set differently. As a result, each letter typed could come up in any one of 150 million ways. Given the almost infinite number of settings, it was not surprising that the Germans remained convinced throughout the war that Enigma was uncrackable. It was the Poles who took the first steps in solving this baffling puzzle. They knew of the existence of the Enigma machine and assembled a team of top mathematicians to crack it. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henry Zygalski. But the team could not decipher messages without knowing the internal wiring of the rotors. The solution was supplied by French intelligence, which sent its Polish allies material gathered by a spy in the German army's cipher department. Amongst this was an Enigma manual. The Poles were able to reconstruct an Enigma machine and began laboriously decoding messages. By July 1939, Hitler was sounding increasingly threatening towards Poland. Britain and France had promised to come to its aid. It was clear that war was coming. So intelligence officers from the three allies met in Warsaw. There, the British and French were astonished at how much the Poles had done in decoding Enigma, and the Poles agreed to send 2 of their reconstructed machines to London. Just 2 weeks after they were handed over, Poland was invaded. By the time Poland fell to the Germans, the Polish cryptographers had destroyed all evidence of their work on Enigma. Some were captured and tortured, but none revealed what they'd been up to. The task was now taken up by the British at their government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park near London. Its head was Commander Alistair Denniston. Denniston recruited a strange collection of mathematicians, chess masters, and crossword puzzle experts to continue the decoding. Among these experts was Alan Turing at Cambridge Don. In 1936, Turing had described the idea of a universal computing machine, a machine that he believed would one day be able to solve all mathematical problems. He used his ideas to design decryption machines known as bronze goddesses. The raw material for Bletchley came from the British Y service, a chain of radio listening stations which monitored and recorded German transmissions. The messages were fed into Bletchley's bronze goddesses, and permutations run until at last the key was found. Once a message had been decrypted, it was translated, analyzed, and passed on to the appropriate authority. From the moment he became Prime Minister and learned of Bletchley's work, Winston Churchill understood its extraordinary importance. He referred to Bletchley's output as his ultra-secret information, and Ultra became its codename. The distribution of Ultra was tightly controlled. Senior commanders were shown only that information which directly concerned their operations. The need to keep the source of the intelligence secret was so great that Churchill insisted that no action could be taken on the basis of Ultra material unless a cover plan had been developed to convince the Germans that the intelligence must have come from another source. The third critical element of the Bletchley operation, after decoding and assessing the material, was keeping control of it. Often Ultra revealed vital information about German plans and actions. News of forthcoming attacks and other intelligence was filed away in a massive card index system. This was constantly mined for answers to questions great and small. By the end of the war, Bletchley was decoding much of the German traffic almost as fast as it was being sent. It was jokingly said that it would have been quicker for a German commander to ring Bletchley to get his orders. It was at sea that the Allies first became aware of how vital information from Ultra could be. An early example of its potential came on June the 8th, 1940. The British aircraft carrier Glorious was covering the convoys withdrawing Allied troops from Norway when Bletchley decoded signals showing the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were approaching its position. A warning was passed to Royal Navy headquarters, but unaware of how accurate the information was likely to be, this chose not to pass it on. The Glorious was intercepted and sunk. The British Navy had learned the hard way just how important the new source of intelligence could be. It was not a mistake it would make again. Bletchley also performed a critical role in the build-up to the Battle of Britain. It had provided a clear picture of the Luftwaffe's order of battle and the overall strategy being adopted by its leader, Hermann Goering. This information convinced the head of British Fighter Command, Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, that his tactic of committing his fighters bit by bit rather than in large numbers was the correct one, a tactic that played a crucial part in preserving the RAF's narrow winning margin. As Britain continued its lonely fight into 1941, it had at last found a way of fighting back. Bletchley Park was ready for action. The major breakthroughs had been made, the systems for exploiting them put in place and well tested. In the coming years, Ultra and the work of Bletchley Park would prove vital to the Allied successes. But as the Battle of Britain and the Blitz ground on, these were still a long way off. Churchill still needed more immediate results. And by early 1941, he thought that he had at last found a way to get them. Nazi Germany might now control most of Western Europe, but Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, now decided to take the war to the Germans.
We shall not flinch from the supreme trial. All will come right out of the depths.
Even before France had surrendered, he was looking for ways of striking back and of keeping resistance alive in the countries which had been overrun. Just as the last troops were being taken off the beaches of Dunkirk, Churchill was already planning ahead. He wrote to his chiefs of staff demanding the formation of raiding forces which could attack the coasts of occupied Europe. Within a few days, a call for volunteers had been circulated to create a force of 5,000 men. They were to be called commandos, after the highly mobile Boer units which had fought the British for 3 years in South Africa at the turn of the century. 10 commando units, each of 500 men, were set up. They began practicing attacks from the sea. One unit was ordered to specialize in parachuting and using assault gliders. This soon became the basis of the separate parachute regiment. Admiral Sir Roger Keyes was appointed Director of Combined Operations. Churchill instructed him to prepare to mount 3 major raids as soon as the threat of an invasion of Britain had passed. One of Key's first tasks was to develop ships which could land his new troops. 3 cross-channel ferries were converted so as to carry landing craft. On March the 4th, 1941, 2 commando units and a demolition squad were landed on the Lofoten Islands off northern Norway. Their main objective was to destroy factories which converted fish oil into glycerine for explosives. The commandos achieved total surprise and landed without a shot being fired. A German armed trawler in the harbour was seized. They quickly destroyed the factories and the fish oil tanks. One officer could not resist using the local post office to send a telegram to A. Hitler, Berlin. It read, "Reference your last speech. I thought you said that wherever British troops land on the continent of Europe, German soldiers will face them. Well, where are they?" The commandos then rounded up 60 Norwegian collaborators and 225 German prisoners before returning without any losses. With them, they also took 115 Norwegian volunteers. These would then join the Free Norwegian forces in Britain. The Lofoten raid was an enormous public relations success and a huge boost for British morale. But its most important result was one which could not be publicized: the capture of a set of rotors for an Enigma machine. Although the machine had been thrown overboard from the armed trawler, its crew forgot the spares. They were to give invaluable help to the cryptographers of Bletchley Park in breaking the German naval codes. Then in December 1941, 4 commando units landed at the Norwegian port of Vagsø and were immediately involved in heavy fighting. The approach to Vagsø was covered by the small island of Malø, on which the Germans had placed artillery. This was quickly overrun, but across the water in Vagsø, the fighting was intense. It took several hours for the main German garrison to be subdued. The commandos then blew up several factories and sank 8 ships before withdrawing. These raids convinced Hitler that sooner or later the British would attempt to retake Norway. So for the remaining 4 years of the war, he kept some 250,000 troops there. Troops which might have proved vital on other fronts. But effective as they were, commando raids were not enough to stop the Nazis. Churchill needed other ways to hurt them, so he focused on the resistance movements in the occupied countries. In July 1940, a Special Operations Executive, SOE, was formed, as Churchill put it, to set Europe ablaze. Its objectives were to encourage sabotage of the enemy war effort, gather intelligence and prepare clandestine forces to disrupt German defenses. The bulk of SOE's activities centered on France. Soon agents were recruited in Britain to build up and coordinate the French resistance networks. Radio operators and couriers were also trained to support them. One problem was how to get these teams into the country. Submarines, high-speed launches and fishing vessels were all tried out, but the German coastal defences proved difficult to penetrate. The answer was aircraft. And in August 1940, a special RAF unit was set up with Whitley bombers and short takeoff and landing Westland Lysanders. Agents and equipment were either parachuted in from the bombers or flown in and brought out by the Lysanders. On moonlit nights, a growing number of reception committees would be waiting as an increasingly widespread network of resistance groups was built up. But all the while, they were hunted by an increasingly sophisticated German counter-espionage system. This used direction-finding equipment to locate hidden radios and double agents to infiltrate networks. The work of SOE agents was desperately perilous, and their life expectancy short. The slightest lapse in concentration might betray them to the Gestapo. Many suffered torture and death. But Churchill was sure it was worth it. Keeping resistance alive in the occupied countries gave hope to millions that liberation would eventually come. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, was also enlisted to raise the hopes of those living under German rule. They broadcast the news in all the languages of the occupied countries. The German penalty for listening to these bulletins was death. But people tuned in regardless. The BBC also played a crucial role in transmitting coded messages to resistance groups. These always came after the 9 o'clock news.
Message très important pour le chef de Gaël. Attention, il va pleuvoir bougrement ce soir.
For the peoples of occupied Europe, the prospect of liberation might only be a distant dream, but in the middle of 1941 it suddenly became more likely. For by then, Britain was no longer alone in fighting Nazism. It had gained a massive ally, but it wasn't America, which Churchill had assiduously been courting. It was the Soviet Union.
können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
Adolf Hitler had never disguised his belief that the Soviet Union would be his regime's ultimate enemy.
Der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation.
He hated communism and saw the vast open spaces and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia as the prize which would finally enable the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, as he stayed at the Berghof, his country retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble. Operation Barbarossa, the assault on the Soviet Union. Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally, and Stalin was keen to keep it that way, for his country was woefully unprepared for war. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Some 3/4 of its senior officers had been shot or imprisoned. Despite appearances, there had been a catastrophic collapse in morale and efficiency. As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler. But Hitler had one other task to perform before he could push on to Russia. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were Germany's firm allies. But in March 1941, the Yugoslav government, sympathetic to Germany, was overthrown by pro-British forces. Its next-door neighbor, Greece, was also pro-British. So, on April the 6th, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. "33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia. They swiftly tore its defenses apart. The capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April the 12th. Greece fell almost as quickly. Despite British help, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The way was now clear for Operation Barbarossa. Over 4 million men were to be deployed. They were supported by more than 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow. And Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. Hitler's generals went silent when he showed them the plan. They were worried it was too ambitious and would spread their forces too thinly. But none dared voice their doubts. The Red Army was much bigger. It had nearly 2 million men within striking distance of the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had more than 20,000 tanks, far outnumbering Germany's 6,000. They were older and less powerful, but they were still a formidable fighting force. The issue for Germany was, could its superior technology and speed overwhelm the Russians before the Red Army's vast numbers ground them down? Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June the 22nd, 1941. The Luftwaffe joined in at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields. Simultaneously, the ground attack began. The Germans swiftly crossed the River Bug on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had total domination of the air. The Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed by the German onrush. On June the 29th, 7 days after the start of the assault, 2 panzer thrusts met up near Minsk, surrounding huge pockets of Soviet troops. As the follow-up infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken. Often the Germans found themselves welcomed as liberators, particularly in the Ukraine, where anti-Russian feeling was widespread. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to have suffered a near breakdown at the news of his betrayal by Hitler. He remained silent for more than a week. Not until July the 3rd did he appeal to his people's patriotism to save the motherland. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, received the news of Operation Barbarossa with very different feelings. It meant the country no longer stood alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain's, no matter what the political differences in the past. He then sent a mission to Moscow to sign a treaty of mutual assistance with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But apart from sending aid by sea, there was little Britain could do immediately to help the Soviet Union. As June turned to July, the German Blitzkrieg slashed deeper into Soviet territory. It was beginning to look as if nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first major strategic blunder. In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army troops were surrounded west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, in particular General Heinz Guderian, begged to be allowed to race on. Operation Barbarossa was working like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, deep inside Russia, and only a couple of 100 miles from Moscow.
On July the 22nd, a panzer pincer movement met to the east of Smolensk, trapping another 310,000 Soviet troops.
Here there was a brief pause, while the rest of the army caught up. Though the tanks could move at spectacular speed, most of the army still had to walk or rely on horse-drawn transport. But it still only took them 5 days before they arrived and began mopping up. The operation was completed in just 9 more days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners began trudging west to captivity. Over 2.5 million never returned. Moscow was now only 200 miles away, and the road lay open. It seemed certain it would fall by the end of the summer, as planned. But elsewhere, the German advance was finding the going more difficult. The Red Army was counterattacking more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler decided Guderian's panzers should delay their advance on Moscow and swing south to Kiev to provide help. Guderian objected strongly, but Hitler was adamant. There should be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. There were already worrying signs the Red Army was not going to be the pushover Hitler had been expecting. Soviet manpower seemed endless. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized. And the Red Army now had some formidable new weapons. In particular, a new tank, the 37-ton T-34. It had a 76mm gun and was faster and better cross-country than the Panzer Mark IV. Yet, as the Blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to miss the warning signs. Guderian's Panzer Group began its thrust south on August the 23rd, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South struck north 3 weeks later. The pincers met east of Kiev on September the 16th. Two more Soviet armies were utterly destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. It was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was besieged. Hitler decided not to storm it, and the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Conditions in the city became dire. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could come in by water. Starvation set in. Over 11,000 people died in November. Not until December could an ice road be opened across the lake, and there was a slight increase in rations. But 3,700 people died of starvation on one day in December alone. Meanwhile, Army Group Center now prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had rejoined it to lead the Blitzkrieg. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the front, and 3-to-1 in aircraft. The assault started on September the 20th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers slashed deep through the Red Army. By October the 7th, yet more Soviet troops were surrounded. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense of the city. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud. By late October, appalling weather and an increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant Army Group Center was still some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his decision earlier in the year to delay his advance on Moscow. At around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers. Another 100,000 prisoners were taken. But they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kharkov was captured on October the 24th, 1941. But the weather was now starting to freeze. The German forces, confident the campaign would be over by the summer, were caught unprepared. With no winter clothing, they now suffered terribly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center was now beginning its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December the 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. But that night, the temperature plunged again. Tank engines would not start. Weapons froze. Many soldiers were severely frostbitten. On December the 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army. But the Germans were confident that come the spring, they could finish the job. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the German onslaught. But all the while, he had another worry, that the Japanese would attack his forces in Siberia. But in November, the Soviet dictator received a message from his top spy in Japan, assuring him the Japanese had no such intention. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. They were well equipped and well trained in winter fighting. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in position near the capital. On December the 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their attempt to capture Moscow, they were hit by a savage Russian attack. First came a massive Soviet artillery barrage. Then swarms of Soviet T-34s crashed through the German defenses. Stunned by the savagery of the attack by an enemy they had assumed was on the ropes, the Germans fell back. For the next 7 days, the Soviet troops tore into the German forces. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, it was a terrible blow. On December the 19th, he sacked his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed command himself. Heinz Guderian was also sacked, along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now ordered that there would be no more retreats. The German troops should fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. It worked. The German line gradually steadied. But Stalin, elated by the Red Army's success, now demanded a massive advance across the whole front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to, and expected, quick results. Now he was dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union and facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Nor was Russia his only headache. On December the 7th, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. Hitler, with almost no thought, also declared war on the US. With no advanced planning, he had taken on a massive new enemy. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to go on the offensive again in Russia. But he needed a new strategy. The original plan of fighting across the whole front was no longer tenable. Moreover, as his economic advisors told him, Germany's oil supplies were running low. So he decided to halt the attacks in the north and instead head for Russia's oil fields in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue, as it was called, envisaged an assault south of Kharkov, with Army Group A swinging down to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B covered its flank along the River Don. Straight away, there was a brutal encounter with Soviet forces trying to retake Kharkov. Another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured. 70,000 were killed. As part of the same operation, the Germans tightened their siege of the port of Sebastopol in the Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders had been under constant bombardment from German artillery, including a massive 400mm railway gun. In late June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans. It was now safe to head for the oil fields. On June the 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way through to the River Don and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A faced stronger resistance. But by July the 9th, it was close to Rostov. Hitler now made a series of what would turn out to be serious strategic blunders. As Army Group B made its way along the Don, the Führer ordered it to capture Stalingrad, even though the city had no immediate strategic significance. The army had suddenly been given a massive new task. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his misjudgment. Frustrated by the slow progress of the campaign in the Caucasus, he diverted the bulk of his panzers down to the mountains. The march on Stalingrad slowed noticeably. The reinforced Army Group A now raced across the Caucasus to within 70 miles of the Caspian, threatening to cut off all the Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress to Stalingrad, he now ordered the panzers back up north. On August the 9th, Army Group A seized the first of the southern oil fields at Maikop. It found them comprehensively trashed. But without reinforcements, it could get no further, and the huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained beyond its grasp. But by now, Hitler's attention had shifted again. In late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, which bore the name of Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun. It would be one of the most crucial battles of World War II. On August the 17th, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army crossed the Don and began a final push on Stalingrad. Six days later, one panzer thrust had reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were fighting in the outer suburbs. Hitler seemed poised for a famous victory. Stalingrad was an important industrial center. It straggled for more than 12 miles along the west bank of the river. Its factories produced over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and guns. The Russian people had turned it into a formidable fortress. They had been helped by Hitler's decision to send Army Group B's panzers to the south. This had given them another 2 weeks to prepare. The German plan was to make a direct assault on the city. Now began one of the most prolonged and intense battles of World War II. Slowly, the Germans edged forward, street by street, with Stuka dive bombers blitzing just ahead of them. The fighting was savage, house to house, room by room. The Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communications, and the ruins above for sniping. Russian reinforcements had to be brought across the river. Often they were under assault from the air. But even so, thousands got through. By late September, the Germans had pushed their way through most of the city, almost to the Volga. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was now an obsession. On October the 4th, 1942, General Paulus launched what was meant to be the final assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, grinding over the rubble and firing point blank into courtyards. One German officer said, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." German victory seemed certain, but in fact, the Germans were dangerously overextended. By mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November the 19th, they attacked the Germans' northern flank. After a massive artillery barrage, the T-34s and assault infantry burst through the German positions. Now, it was the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. The next day, a Soviet assault in the south was equally successful. And on November the 23rd, these pincer movements met west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German 6th Army. General Paulus, in charge of the German forces, could have broken out, but Hitler ordered him to stand and fight. The Führer had been assured by the Luftwaffe that sufficient supplies could be airlifted into Stalingrad. This was enough for him to announce that the German positions must hold out until relieved. To help Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the overall German commander in the region, launched Operation Winter Storm on December the 12th. It was an attempt by the German panzers to break the Soviet encirclement of the city. For 2 days it went well, but then Red Army resistance increased. By December the 23rd, the German rescue attempt had ground to a halt about 30 miles from the city. Manstein advised the beleaguered Paulus to attempt to break out of Stalingrad. But Paulus wanted Hitler's permission. This was refused. It was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov now unleashed the next stage of his master plan. It was a massive assault on the Panzer Relief Operation. The panzers were pushed back, away from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had gone. Worse still, plans to airlift aid into the city were a fiasco. The German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive. They never received more than 80. The weather was too bad, and the Red Air Force now commanded the skies. Steadily, the Soviet troops squeezed in on the encircled Germans. 200,000 men were trapped. On January the 8th, the Soviets called on the Germans to surrender. They refused. On January the 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. Over 100,000 men stumbled off into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a bloody battle. The Germans had been savaged. They had lost some 300,000 of their men and at least as many of their allies. The Russians had lost about the same number, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far, but it wouldn't be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting massive defeats on Hitler's forces across the whole Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a great triumph for the Soviet army. Now its operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, set his sights on Germany's Army Group A, still camped in the Caucasus. Soviet troops thrust their way west of Stalingrad, and by early December 1942 were within 120 miles of Rostov. there was a real possibility all the German forces in the south would be cut off. With little choice, Hitler reluctantly gave Army Group A permission to fall back. Over the next month, the Germans fought a skillful rearguard action. Hundreds of thousands of troops withdrew. Then, on January the 12th, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out assault. The Soviets attacked along a 500-mile front. Outnumbered 7-1, von Manstein, the overall commander of German forces in the region, fought a brilliant mobile retreat. But by the end of February, the Red Army had recaptured both Kursk and the nearby city of Kharkov. This Russian winter offensive had struck a crippling blow to German power. Over a matter of months, it had lost 1 million men and vast numbers of tanks and guns. The Red Army still had enormous reserves of manpower. It was also benefiting from a huge increase in weapons production and aid from the United States and Britain. The Germans also no longer had the technological upper hand. The T-34 tank was more than a match for the Panzer Mark IV. And they also had the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket system, which shattered German troops. Yet Hitler refused to give up hope. He still dreamed of a preemptive summer assault that would throw the Soviet Union off balance and regain the initiative. The city of Kursk seemed the obvious place to start. Here, the Soviet assault had pushed a bulge deep into the German lines. It looked temptingly exposed. Hitler decided it should be cut off and annihilated. He also had an ace up his sleeve. The German counterattack would be led by a new generation of German tanks, specially designed to combat the formidable Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55-ton Tiger had a lethal 88mm gun, and its frontal armor made it almost impervious to Soviet tank guns. And then there was the faster 43-ton Panther with a new 75mm gun, also capable of knocking out the T-34. These tanks were so new, Hitler was forced to delay the attack whilst sufficient numbers were manufactured and delivered to the front. But even as the German forces began to assemble, the Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, guessed what was about to happen. Soon afterwards, he received information from a Soviet spy ring inside the German High Command, confirming the site of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire. He also massively built up Soviet forces in the area, pulling in troops and tanks from less vulnerable parts of the front. By the eve of the assault on Kursk, the Germans were hugely outnumbered by Soviet defenders, who also knew exactly when the Germans would attack. On July the 5th, 1943, just as the German troops prepared to assault, they were hit by a huge Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning, the panzers still rolled forward. But this time, they were up against a well-entrenched enemy. There was no realistic chance of a lightning Blitzkrieg breakthrough. The results were disastrous. In the north, the German army gained a mere 6 miles for the loss of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans fared a little better. A wedge 25 miles deep was driven into the Soviet defenses, but it also came at a high price. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks destroyed. But for a brief moment, it looked as if a German breakthrough might be possible. Then Zhukov threw in his reserves. On July the 12th, 1943, 900 tanks charged into the German flank. Almost 2,000 tanks now engaged in what was the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34s drove into the German lines and opened fire at point-blank range. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost a further 350 tanks and were retreating. Meanwhile, overhead, there was an epic air battle. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force established supremacy over the Luftwaffe. Now the Russians could unleash their formidable Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik tank killers. By July the 23rd, the Germans had lost any ground they had gained, and with it, the cream of their army. Hitler's adventure at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and more than 700 tanks. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Russians had turned the tide of the war.